Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the 10th episode of the story, and when Naruto's father met his mother, his first thought was that a village out there must be missing its idiot. This story is from Silver Shine. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. He didn't know what Kushina had expected when she'd offered to partner with him on this mission, but it was clear that it wasn't this. When he'd first mentioned the need for research, an expression had come over her face like he'd just suggested they take a bath in sludge. When he'd added that the library would be a good place to start, her eyes had glazed over and had been like that ever since, and though she'd followed him without complaint, it was clear that she would rather be somewhere else. Minato quite liked being in the farthest wings of the library, where the oldest books and scrolls were kept. It was dry, warm, and smelled of aged leather and parchment, quiet, but all these documents and tomes contained 100 chattering voices just waiting to be heard. Some of the books were as old as the village itself. Some were even older. With his back to a radiator, Minato had surrounded himself with a nice pile of volumes. A few modern ones with more up-to-date information, like Shinobi and the Art of Death, lay by his knee alongside older books like the Comprehensive Encyclopedia of Kenjutsu, which was far from comprehensive, but it included a lot descriptions of forbidden techniques that had been forgotten by the modern world. At first Kushina had done her part, picking up one of his books and skimming it with a look of intense concentration. Unfortunately, the next time he looked up she had disappeared. When she reappeared again, she was reading a small paperback with lurid art of zombies on the cover. "This guy digs up bodies to create his own army of the undead," she said to him after a while. "That's not research," he replied patiently, "that's fiction. It's not just important to figure out how he's doing it. We need to figure out why as well," she retorted. "Unless he gets his ideas from cheap horror novels, I doubt the answer will be in there." She ignored him and carried on reading. Minato turned back to his own, but he was speed-reading the final chapter, and so far this author had not mentioned any forbidden jutsu that had power over death. Orochimaru hadn't been kidding when he'd called it a rare kind of jutsu. At last he tossed aside the book and picked up a volume published some 30 years ago that promised accounts of jutsu so salacious that no other books would write about them. Of course, half the accounts Minato read he had already seen described in 15 other books. He browsed on, however, until he came to the chapter called The Masters of Death. It began, "Many a man has sought to master the world around him, whether in the form of elements, his land, or his fellow man. But that which men desire most to control is that which eludes him the most. To take life is the shinobi's purpose. To give it back escapes all but the most exceptional of individuals." Minato skimmed on. He was already beginning to understand just how rare the jutsu was. What he needed was examples. "Ah-ha," he said aloud, startling Kushina. The author had moved on to describe cases of jutsu forbidden for their use of corpses. Some Sunanin who specialized in puppetry had been known to use corpses on the battlefield if they ran out of custom-made puppets. But this wasn't so much control over life and death as it was disrespectful of the dead. A more promising example given was of a tribe of unaffiliated mountain shinobi who could implant the life force of other people or animals into the recently deceased to give the appearance of reanimation, however temporary. These reanimated bodies could not be controlled, however. He grew more disappointed as the examples got weaker from there and the end of the chapter grew closer. He skimmed the last paragraph where the author redundantly reiterated how rare manipulation of the dead was, if not out of complication but because of the moral objection to such techniques. Only one line leapt out at him. Even the great Naidame Hokage was forced to abandon the creation of a jutsu to revive the dead, and after declaring his own work too abhorrent to share it was sealed away in secrecy, incomplete. The Naidame invented a forbidden technique that revived dead people, Minato said aloud. "Did you know that?" Kushina frowned. "And? That's all it says." He clapped the book shut with a sigh. I suppose there wouldn't be much point classifying these things as forbidden if you could freely read up all their details in a local library. There are books on the Nidaime, aren't there? Kushina pointed out, bobbing to her feet. I'll go find some. I think I'll go with you. Spending all morning sitting amongst these books had begun to cramp his legs and he was keen to stretch them. They found the history section, and the subsection devoted to historical figures. Kushina pulled a volume from the first bookshelf she came to. This him? She asked, pointing to the photograph of a man on its cover. Looks like it. Konoha has good taste in leaders after all, she said, looking at the Nidaime appreciatively. In Whirlpool our leaders tended towards the old and grisly. What about your dad? He inquired. Mother had to force him at knife point to shave and dress in a fresh shirt for official photos. She complained he looked like a tramp the rest of the time, and more so after he became the leader, although that may have been all the stress of trying to hold together a country that was falling apart, she said, beginning to flip through the book, skipping the text to focus mainly on the pictures. There's a lot the history books don't tell you, isn't there? Well, we don't need to know what the Nidaime wore on his days off, he replied, taking down a thick text from a shelf. We just need to know more about this kenjutsu he created. They browsed in silence. There had to be at least 12 books on this one particular man and 33 in total if you included the joint biographies with his older brother. Not many appeared to mention the kenjutsu in his list of created jutsu and talents, and the ones that did glossed over it in vague terms. The library was always a quiet place, but sometimes people entered and carried on their conversations from the street. One such pair was passing on the other side of Minato's bookshelf, hidden from view though their gossip was easy to make out. The silence of the library had an unfortunate tendency to draw attention to conversations that might otherwise not have been heard. Don't know who he thinks he is. I'm surprised he has the nerve to show his face at headquarters today. They're saying the outpost at the Earth border was attacked last night. If any more die, it's on him. How did a man like that ever become a jonin in the first place? The Hokage should demote him, if you ask me. The conversation faded away down the alleys of books and Minato glanced across at Kushina, wondering if she'd heard it. With her eyes fixed glassily at one point on the page she was reading and her hands gripping her book so hard she was threatening to tear the spine in half, he would have to say, yes, she had heard. They're idiots, he told her quietly. What? She responded distantly, as if she didn't know what he was talking about. He returned to his book, thought he couldn't help noticing that Kushina did a lot more fidgeting after that and couldn't keep still. Eventually he picked up another book and came across a passage of interest. Hey, listen to this one, he said, running a finger under the lines as he read them. Aside from his incredibly strong affinity for the water element, the Nidaime Hokage was most famous for his tofu-based recipes. No, wait, that's not it. Oh yes. Less is known about the Hokage's experimental phase in his youth, when he is said to have created one of the world's first true reanimation jutsu, a technique in which the user gives life back to the dead. The jutsu allegedly allowed the user to summon the souls of the deceased from the beyond and tie them to their earthly body once more, making them nearly invulnerable to mortal injuries and in the thrall of the user. The Hokage theorized that a soul could be implanted into a living sacrifice, and the resulting union would be a true rebirth, and an indestructible physical form. However, the Hokage was horrified at the implications of his own creation and never completed it. He declared it a forbidden technique and sealed it away in one of Konoha's vaults, but to this day many regard it as the most perfect and powerful technique ever created by man. Kushina stared at him. Does that sound like the technique you came across? I don't know. The dead man I fought was definitely being controlled and this sort of sounds similar. If it's stored in one of Konoha's vaults, there'll be records of who has accessed it or if it's been broken into, he said. If this is the technique, we'll know. I'll find Sensei and ask him, Kushina suggested. You think he'll know something about this? Sensei knows practically everything, she said confidently, but he thought she was just looking for a good excuse to go see Tsukumo that wouldn't seem like pity. All right, he said, understanding. I'll keep researching. Kushina moved past him, brushing her hand gratefully across his forearm before disappearing between the stacks of books. In her absence, Minato wandered back to his bolt hole at the back of the library with a new armful of books in hand. He doubted there was much else he could learn about the Nidame's jutsu from them, but the more he read about the man, the more interesting he became. The subject of Hokage past and present had been covered extensively in the academy. It was one of the first subjects they were taught, as the foundation of a good shinobi education must always include the architects of their way of life. Everyone had their favorite. Minato had always preferred reading about the Shodai of the three, as he seemed like a man with big dreams and even bigger powers. He was almost more myth than man, and by comparison his younger brother was a little less exciting even if his accomplishments were just as impressive. The Shodai may have founded the village and brought about an era of union and peace, which died with him, but it was the Nidame who had founded the social services, the hospital, the school, and the police force and made the village what it was. But perhaps it was his jutsu that Minato found most interesting. Besides his proclivity to play God with life and death, Minato could definitely appreciate a guy who knew his way around spacetime jutsu. An insistent little clicking noise brought Minato's nose out of his book. He looked vacantly towards the source of the noise, a dusty little window above the bookshelves that let in just enough light to read by. A tiny ball of feathers was just visible, hopping along the ledge and clacking its small beak against the dirty glass like it might have been trying to break through. Yes, Minato sighed, rising to his feet once more. The bird flew away and Minato set his books to one side, realizing his research would have to wait. The Hokage had called an emergency secret meeting of the Jonin. Every single Jonin in Konoha could comfortably fit into the Hokage's chambers. There were 25 of them in total standing in tense congregation, and as one of the last to arrive Minato joined the back of the crowd. He looked across and saw Tsukumo leaning against the back wall, looking apart from proceedings. He must have been radioactive the way every other person in the room seemed to be trying hard to keep their distance while impressively managing to ignore his presence at the same time. Since the Hokage had not yet arrived, Minato joined him by the wall. "Watch who you're cozying up to," Tsukumo said straight off, fixing him with a hard look. "Even your popularity has limits." Minato ignored him. Kushina was looking for you earlier. Did you speak to her? He asked. He shook his head. Minato wondered if Tsukumo might have been avoiding her. "Any idea why we've been called?" "Oh, I could make a few guesses," Tsukumo remarked darkly, and a moment later the side room door opened and the Hokage entered, ghosted by the figure of his student, Orochimaru. At once the room fell silent and everyone stood to attention. "Thank you," said the Hokage distractedly, moving behind his desk though he didn't sit down. "We shall get straight to business. We have received a communication from IWA a few hours ago." "Orochimaru?" The Sannin unrolled a scroll and read from it. Minato didn't know if it was Orochimaru's husky and slightly menacing tone of voice that made the hair rise on the back of his neck, or the content of the message he read out. "Konoha has shown the world what it really is. Your hostile actions and meddling will no longer be tolerated. The rock will crush the leaf. Signed, the Sandaime Tsuchikage." That seemed to be all the communication contained, and although Minato strongly resisted the urge to look at Tsukumo, knowing exactly what kind of meddling the Tsuchikage was referring to, others in the room felt no such compunction and stared openly. "Anoki, that old bastard," the Hokage grumbled beneath his breath. "So it's war?" asked Shikaku who, for reasons baffling even to himself, had been promoted 2 months ago. "It's likely," said the Hokage. "I have already received reports that IWA Nin are congregating near the border. They outnumber us and their strength make them difficult to head off, but they lack strategic innovation. They'll follow the same pattern as their last invasion and attempt to gain control of the neutral region before marching on us. Our settlements near the border must be defended and preparations must be made for refugees fleeing the neutral region. When I call your name, your mission will be to gather a team and defend key points. Our best chance is to work with the geography, and with any luck their incursion can be held off at the Hayu Valley. Now, these teams will be led by Shigura Yajuri. He named half the people in the room before he came to Minato. Namikaze Minato, you may continue with your current assignment, although priority for resources go to the Jonin teams. Before Minato could protest, he plowed on. The rest of you will remain in Konoha for now, but you will be concentrating on Kyomo's forces. While IWA makes its move, we need to know what they're up to and if we need to take similar action. Minato waited patiently as the Hokage laid out his points and commands. This was one of the biggest undertakings he'd seen in his time as a Jonin, and chances were that the people of this village would remain blissfully ignorant of what was happening, at least until the body count grew too high to cover up. Whether it would get to that point was another matter. History was filled with short secret invasions that were lost energy like a wave lapping at a beach, and those went unnoticed by the general population. But if Kyomo got involved, or Suna smelled blood in the water and joined the fray to exact revenge for their Kazekage, it would be another world war. If it came to 3 villages against 1, Konoha was certain to be obliterated. Which made Minato wonder why, when their moves over the next 24 hours could decide the fate of the village, was the Hokage not deploying him. When the old man finally called, dismissed, Minato weaved through the crowd of departing Jonin to stand before the desk. I should go with them, he said. My other assignment can wait. No, it can't, the Hokage told him bluntly. We already know that the quarry you are looking for takes advantage of conflict to gather more victims. This might be the best opportunity to catch him, as well as crucial in saving lives. Behind the Hokage, Orochimaru flicked an eyebrow up at him with a slight smile. No doubt he may have been bitter that Minato had taken over an assignment he had failed, and any evidence that it inconvenienced Minato pleased him no end. With a patient sigh, Minato nodded. Of course, Hokage-sama, Hokage Saratobi-sama, Tsukumo cut in, reaching the desk too. I should lead a team as well. Again? Orochimaru wondered softly. Because you certainly did us proud the last time. You're not working for IWA, are you? Tsukumo looked at the Sannin as if he'd been punched. The Hokage held up his hand. That is quite unnecessary, Orochimaru, he said sharply. But Tsukumo, I would prefer it if you remain in the village for now. How am I to redeem my actions if I can't defend the village? Tsukumo demanded. The Hokage shook his head impatiently. I can't send you out with the way things are. It is better you keep a low profile and wait for things to blow over before returning to duty. Besides which, I didn't call you here today. You shouldn't have come. Then I've all but officially been stripped of my rank. Tsukumo's smile was grim and hollow. 2 nations are moved to war over my mistake, but if the best I can do to defend my village is to go home and hide in disgrace, so be it. He turned and left. Minato didn't think he'd ever felt more horrible, though he didn't who deserved his anger the most. The Hokage, for his snub. Orochimaru for his cruel words. Everyone else for their fickle nature, or himself for not knowing how to rectify the situation beyond passivity? Is that all, Minato? The Hokage asked wearily. Minato's gaze drifted over Orochimaru's faintly smug visage and kept his own face tightly schooled of all emotion. If I'm to continue with my current assignment, there is something I need to ask, he said. If I can help, the Hokage said, nodding, but I'm needed in the war room, so please walk with me. Minato fell into step behind him, just ahead of Orochimaru. Yes, sir. It's about your sensei. Which one? The Naidame, sir, he explained. Is it true that he invented a forbidden jutsu? Ah, yes, and why would that interest you? No doubt you're about to ask me where it was stored? No doubt, agreed Minato. I only ask because I believe the abductor might be using that particular jutsu. Is it possible your vault has been broken into? The Hokage marched on in silence, considering his words. Are you sure you're on the right track, Minato? I'm just following one possible lead. But how many jutsu do you know of that can animate the dead? My sensei's jutsu was more about retrieving souls than animating the dead, the Hokage corrected, though as it was an incomplete jutsu, who can say how it manifested? I never witnessed it. I can also assure you that my personal vault for forbidden techniques has never been broken into, not that it matters. The Night Aim's jutsu is not stored in Konoha. That particular technique required a little more protection and was stored in one of the fire temples. It's presided over by some of Sensei's descendants, I believe. Which temple? Minato pressed. It's a secret, of course. His heart fell. Oh. Although, on a completely different note, I don't mind telling you my sensei's grandson is a marvelous fellow. A monk in one of the fire temples, don't you know? The one at the edge of the Hayu Valley, no less. A bit of a precarious position right now, if you ask me, so perhaps they wouldn't a helping hand right now? Minato suppressed a smile. Perhaps they would, Hokage-sama. He turned to look with veiled triumph at Orochimaru, but at that moment he realized the Sannin had disappeared. Minato could have sworn he'd been right behind them only a moment ago. Is something the matter? The Hokage asked, noticing his pause. No, sir. I'll return to my duties now. He bowed and departed. If he hurried, he would be able to find Kushina and they could leave for the fire temple before the light started to fade. So it really is war then? Kushina sighed, looking at him through the reflection of her bedroom mirror. The comb that had been flashing through her hair was set down and for a moment her gaze turned distant as she twisted her hair over one shoulder. The way she combed her fingers absently through her tresses was almost hypnotic. Minato didn't want to intrude upon her silence. Eventually her thoughts returned and she looked up at him. I should be amazed the Hokage hasn't rushed you straight off to the front line. Do you think we'll really find answers at this temple? Who knows? He came forward to twirl a lock of her hair around his finger, enjoying the silken texture. If it turns up nothing, we're back to square one, so we might as well check it out, even if it's just to confirm we're wrong. All right, she said, you're the boss. But I want to say goodbye to Sensei before we go. Sure. The Hokage was pretty harsh on him today. He probably needs cheering up. Kushina said nothing, but handed him her special reinforced hair toggle and let him tie her hair up in the heaped bun she usually wore on missions away from the village. She watched him suspiciously as he arranged the flyaway ends of her hair in a perfect fan that covered the toggle from sight. You're rather too good at that, she remarked. I watched and learned, he replied happily. I really should just cut it all off, she said, watching him even more closely. Much more practical. He sucked in a sharp breath. As tempting as it was to scream no and then try to purge the village of any and all pairs of scissors, he knew she was only winding him up. Everyone had their buttons. For Minato, it was Kushina's hair. For Kushina it was, well, almost everything. She reached up behind her and patted him on the cheek. Just kidding. We better get moving if we want to make any progress today. Once Kushina's hair was sorted, preparing for a trip was a fairly swift feat. Minato threw his backpack on his bed and filled it with all the necessary items and equipment he'd need. A ninja had to be ready to drop everything at a moment's notice and answer the call of duty when required, and all his scrolls and blades were meticulously maintained and waiting to be packed. They locked the house up and headed at once for the Hatake residence and argued the whole way over which route on the map to take to the temple. Minato said the forest was more direct, but Kushina insisted the roads would be quicker, since Minato was bound to get them lost if they didn't have the benefit of signposts every few hundred yards of the way. Kakashi was out on the porch when they arrived, bouncing a ball against the side of the house and catching it with a speed and precision that most adults couldn't have managed. "Hey, Kakashi," Minato greeted cheerfully. "Where's your dad?" The boy looked at them with flat displeasure. "Inside." While Kushina let herself into the house without so much as a knock, Minato hesitated. "What's wrong, Kakashi?" "Nothing," the boy grunted sulkily. "Nothing?" repeated Minato disbelievingly. "I thought you'd be happy now that your dad's back." "Why?" Kakashi snatched the ball out of midair. "He doesn't want to talk, he doesn't want to play. What good is he? He'd rather be at work than with me." Minato sighed. "That's not true. Your dad's going through a rough patch at work, so he's a bit down, that's all. He'll cheer up soon." Kakashi didn't look at all convinced. "Did you talk to him about mentoring me?" Minato cleared his throat. "The important thing is, you forgot, didn't you? I haven't had the opportunity yet. And your dad still wants you to complete your education. I already passed the Chunin exam. And what good is a Chunin who can't do simple algebra?" "Algebra what?" Minato patted him on the shoulder. "Don't rush to grow up so soon. Take your time, enjoy your friendships at the academy, and when you're ready, you'll be ready." Even as he said them, he realized his words were just false reassurances. Sending select Jonin teams out to assess the situation and repel the first possible invasion forces was the first step before either side decided which strip of dirt they would fight to the death over and entrenched combat set in. The fight could be over in days or it could drag on for years. In any case, the administration wouldn't care if Kakashi's education was still incomplete. Like Minato many years ago, he would be one of the first deployed, and then a new kind of education would commence with a war zone for a classroom, and the fight for day-to-day survival would be the only lesson. In a village like this, childhood only lasted as long as peace permitted. "How about this? When I get back from my mission, I'll take you on officially as my student," he offered. At least this way the council couldn't automatically order an 8-year-old out with the other Chunin to the front lines without Minato's approval. An adequate tool he might have been in the eyes of the village, but he was still just a child whose only understanding of death was that of a pet guinea pig. "Do you mean it?" Kakashi demanded. "Of course, I mean it." Minato grinned at him and nodded his head toward the door. "Come on, let's see what the other two are up to." The other two were sitting in the lounge, conversing in low, serious tones. Minato hovered with Kakashi in the hall, not wanting to interrupt but still able to make out clearly what they were saying. "It's too late to stop it and people are going to die," he heard Tsukumo say. "I can't ignore that." "I'm not asking you to," Kushina rebuked, "but you can't blame it on yourself. Not everything is about you. Iwa's actions were inevitable. But if I had succeeded, it would be Kumo they would be marching on. It wasn't you who failed that mission. The only one you can blame is that Jinchuriki." "No," said Tsukumo quietly. "I can't. You know I can't." Kushina's head dropped. She placed her hand on Tsukumo's arm and squeezed. "I'll be back soon." "Take your time," he said, patting the top of her hand. "Obviously I won't be going anywhere." With great reluctance, Kushina rose and joined Minato by the door. Kakashi took one look at her and opened his arms wide in plaintive demand. "Take care of each other," Tsukumo said to Minato, as Kushina bent down to envelope Kakashi in a bear hug and planted a loud kiss on his cheek. By this age most children were embarrassed to be shown affection by adults, and though Kakashi was no exception, almost all young boys made exceptions for pretty ladies who smelled nice. "Take care of your dad for me," she whispered to him, and she was also one of the few people Kakashi would obey unquestioningly, for he nodded with a faint blush. With a last respectful nod to Kushina's sensei, they set off on their way. In the end they took neither the road nor the forest, but the river. Following it northwest was the only natural path to the Hayu Valley where the fire temple lay, and they followed its course well into the night. There was only a sliver of moon hanging in the sky, not enough to see by, so when the sun set Minato pulled out his electric lamp and led the way across the water. Kushina seemed a little preoccupied and didn't talk much, though Minato wasn't concerned. There wasn't much to say and silence was just as companionable as conversation when it came to Kushina. They were both focused on getting to the fire temple before morning, but they'd already been stopped once by a troop of Konoha nin heading for the border who'd seen the light of their lamp. That had wasted half an hour of their journey, trying to explain to another jonin what they were up to and that they really were who they said they were. The other jonin only became convinced when Kushina threatened to write a letter of complaint to the Hokage with his spine. A mild inconvenience, but when Minato held the lamp to his watch he saw that they had to be less than an hour away from the temple. "Do you smell smoke?" Kushina asked him. Minato looked back at her, shaking his head. "Huh," she grunted, looking sideways into the darkness with a troubled frown creasing her forehead. "The fire temple should be close by," he said, and pointed to a huge black shadow looming up to their left to block out the stars. "If we climb that hill we might be able to see it from the top." They left the river and clambered up the slope, but something strange began to happen as they made their ascent. Minato looked ahead to the skyline and realized the stars were fading, replaced by the kind of dull orange glow he normally only saw over Konoha. But aside from the temple there could be no light pollution around this wild, largely untouched valley. The stench of smoke hit Minato then, and as they crested the hill all became clear. The valley tumbled away before them, like the land had been scooped away before the hills rose once more in a ridge miles away. They shouldn't have been able to see them on a night as dark as this one, but tonight the hills were outlined with flickering dashes of glowing orange light. "They've set the hills on fire," Kushina whispered. "Maybe there's a battle over there," he said. It was eerie how quiet everything was, even while looking at what was a raging inferno burning through acres of forest just a few miles away. "What should we do?" Kushina asked uncertainly. "Do we check it out?" Minato wanted to, dearly, but they were not prepared. They were on a fact-finding mission with no backup, and running into burning forests looking for untold numbers of enemies was not their prerogative. "We have our mission," he said to Kushina. "We should stick to it." After all, they had both witnessed the foibles of those who abandoned their missions. "Then I think the temple is this way," Kushina said, taking the lamp from him to lead the way down the hill again, a little faster than before. Minato followed, wondering if this was the right decision. If he had come alone on this mission perhaps he would have crossed the valley to investigate whether the fires had been started by farmers or invaders. With Kushina, his decisions were tinged with caution. He didn't want to put her in undue danger. If they came across a full complement of IWA nin, he wasn't sure he could protect both her and himself. Their mission would save lives if they succeeded, but he couldn't help but wonder if there were people on those distant hills that needed more immediate rescue. He didn't blame Tsukumo for choosing the latter. Kushina's thoughts must have been running in the same direction as him, for after a while she spoke up again. "I'm really worried about him." There was no question of who she meant. "I'm sure Tsukumo will be all right," he said. "I think you're underestimating him." "You never saw him when his wife died," she reminded him sharply. "You weren't the 13-year-old girl having to remind her sensei to get dressed and feed his baby. He's not a strong man, Minato. He already had one breakdown, I don't want him to suffer another." He almost stopped in surprise. "Did you really have to deal with that?" He remembered she had written to him about it while he was fighting on the water country border, but she had never actually spoken of since. "Before I was sent away to fight, yes. But back then he had a lot of support from everyone else too. This time he's disgraced. It's only going to get worse when people start dying. He's stupid enough to take it all on himself." Well. Minato said slowly, searching for the right reassuring words that might even have been the truth. Losing a mission isn't like losing your wife. I doubt he'd get that bad again. They walked along in silence as Kushina thought about this. Maybe, she said quietly. He really did love her. It was horrible. She just went on a mission and she never came back, and those bastards in Suna wouldn't return her body. Sensei never got a chance to say goodbye to her. He seemed okay at first, but then he just fell apart. I know it's hard to imagine him like that, but it's true. It's not that hard to imagine, Minato said. When you love someone so much that just the thought of losing them makes you more scared of anything else in your life. I don't think it's strange to break down. After a moment he added, I think I'd die if I lost you. She stopped short and swung the lamp towards him. You shouldn't say that, she said, so suddenly and forcefully that he froze. If anything happens to me, you've got to keep living. He stared at her, taken aback. I'm not worth losing your life over. No one is, she went on. That's what my mother said to me before and I didn't give up because she was right. I don't want to lose anyone else I love, especially not over something stupid like that. No one's going to die, so we should just stop talking about it. I can look after myself. And I would die before I ever let anything happen to you, so there. She turned away to stalk onward, but she was immediately swung back as Minato crossed the short distance between them and caught her elbow. Before she could scold him for knocking the lantern from her hand, his mouth closed over hers and his arms went around her. He broke the kiss only long enough to see her confusion and say, I was just trying to tell you how much you mean to me, idiot. Then say, I love you, like a normal person, she replied. Freak. All this talk of losing people had him unsettled and a little desperate to remind himself that she was still with him, as close and safe and in as good health as she'd ever been. He kissed her again, deeper, and felt her arms wind around his neck more tightly as her body pressed into his. There was no doubting she was alive. Her curves were warm and soft and such a pleasure to his senses to stroke. And when he cupped his hand against her bottom, she made the cutest moan he'd ever heard. Normally at this point she would be drawing away and joking that she needed to cool off. Right now, however, either because of their setting or their conversation, she wasn't stopping. He should have known it was too good to be true. Unfortunately, his only inkling that something was wrong was the terrific impact against his side and shoulder, and the next thing he knew, he'd been thrown against a tree. His first day's thought was that he must have pissed Kushina off somehow, but even she couldn't hit that hard. Later she would tell him he'd been hit by a jet of water, though at the time he could only assume it was a ton of bricks. His jumbled thoughts took a moment to reassemble themselves enough to twig they were under attack, and by then he was pinned to the ground with at least 2 people kneeling on his arms and a third on his back. Are you all right, young lady? A 4th man was standing with Kushina, holding up the lamp she'd dropped earlier. What are you doing? She shouted back. Get them off him. He wasn't attacking you, asked the man. No, she cried. He's my boyfriend. It looked like he was strangling you. No, he's just enthusiastic. Minato sighed, his dripping face thumping back into the soft earth. You can go ahead and kill me now, he said to the men pinning him down. Better let him up, said the man with the lamp. No harm done, though I would remind you too that you're on sacred ground, so perhaps you could, refrain. The pressure eased off Minato's arms and back, and he carefully rose to his feet once more, uncomfortably aware that every cold, wet inch of clothing was sticking to him in all sorts of uncomfortable places. Now that he got his first good look at their attackers, he realized that while they didn't look like Iwa Nin, they certainly weren't from Konoha either. The fire symbol on their deep red robes revealed their allegiance, however. Are you monks from the fire temple? He asked them, looking at each of their regimentally bald. The only one who had hair was the man holding his lamp. That we are, said the monk. We don't normally greet people like this, but we've been warned to expect IWA to attack, so we're in full blackout. We saw your light and came to investigate, and when we saw you knock it from the lovely young lady's hand we apologize. It's a very dark night and everyone's a little jumpy. Did you get separated from your team? We were looking for you actually, Minato told him. Me? The monk blinked in surprise. What have I done now? No, your temple, I mean. We're on a mission. Extraordinary, said the monk, peering at him. Do I know you? You look very familiar. He's the yellow flash, supplied Kushina. People usually gasped at this point, or began looking nervous. Judging from the long silence as the man turned this strange name over in his head, he clearly had never heard of it before. He just nodded politely. A gang name? Minato wondered if he was being teased. My legendary title. They give those to teenagers these days? I'm 21. After a beat, the monk gave him a sympathetic look. I bet you have trouble buying drinks. Like you wouldn't believe, Minato agreed. Not that our order would know much about those sinful pollutants, said one of the other monks piously. Oh, yes, said the first monk blithely. Of course. Now let's get back to the temple before more unsavory characters try to ambush you. They had been much closer to the temple than they'd realized. In full blackout it was impossible to see the structure hidden amongst the trees until they were virtually on top of it and the light of the lamp fell on an old, wooden door that appeared from nowhere. The monks ushered them inside, down cool stairwells into underground chambers where candles were fetched and matches were struck. No electricity in the temple, explained the monk with hair. They say it's sacrilegious to light the fire temple with anything other than fire. I say it's a damn nuisance, but there you go. Sensei, sighed one of the junior monks. You're the senior monk here? Kushina asked politely. Yes, though you'd be forgiven for thinking otherwise, he said, casting a vague glare in the direction of his scolding subordinates. I didn't realize the senior monks were allowed hair, she said. Ah, no, he said. We're not. Then why, we can't make him shave, said a junior monk. We've tried. Still doesn't stop you coming at me while I sleep with razors at least once a month, the senior monk reminded them. Now let's step into my office and discuss this mission of yours. The rest of you, don't you have some fire to worship or something? Off with you. The rest of the monks drifted away, looking pained, while Kushina and Minato were escorted into a warm side room that looked more like someone's sparse bedroom than an office. There wasn't much in the way of furniture aside from a thin futon rolled up in the corner, but at least the fire pit in the middle of the room was full of hot embers and gently smoking wood. That had to be at least one bonus of being in an order that deified fire. The monk set down the electric lantern and switched it off at last, and with the same hand motioned at the fire. Please feel free to sit and remove your clothes, he said. Kushina frowned at him. Excuse me? Oh, not you. Your friend needs to dry off, but you're welcome to join him. Me, I'll spare you the sight of this pasty old flesh. Not that the monk looked particularly old. He was around the same age as Hatake Tsukumo, but as he sat down a sneaking suspicion of Minato's was confirmed. It was hard to tell with such long, voluminous sleeves, but the reason he kept using his left hand for everything was because his right arm appeared to end at the elbow. The man had clearly been a ninja once upon a time, but an injury like that usually brought their kind of career to an abrupt stop. A lot of jutsu demanded seals which required both hands, and even those who prioritized in taijutsu, it was difficult to compensate for a missing limb, if not impossible for most. Those veterans who suffered such grievous injuries were usually retired quietly, or in this case, joined an occupation with a more sedentary lifestyle. As Minato stripped his outer clothes off and sat down, the monk lifted a stone flag from the floor beside him and reached inside. Cocoa? He inquired, producing a battered tin from his hidden cache. It looked like he was having trouble adjusting to the stringent requirements of this occupation too. Please, he and Kushina murmured. I'm Han, said the monk as he set up a pot of water to boil. I'm the senior of this temple, so if you're here on behalf of Konoha, you can address your concerns to me. I'll try to help in any way I can. Kushina had a very pressing concern. Do you have any food? Yes. Han reached down into his hidden store again for a packet of biscuits, no doubt just as forbidden as everything else. Please help yourself. Mr. Flash, would you like a blanket? I see you're shivering over there. I'm fine. The fire was already working its magic. I apologize again for dousing you, said Han. Minato raised an eyebrow. That was you? Surprised? Han lifted his shortened arm, and Kushina choked on her biscuit, having only just noticed. It's true I lost most of my jutsu the day I lost my right hand, but I've always been able to use water jutsu. Handed down to me from grandfather, as was this temple. Then you're the Nidame's grandson? Minato said. You're Senju? Senju Hanaruda Kuroni. He nodded. But I prefer Han. And what are you when you're not flashing? I'm Namikaze Minato and this is Uzumaki Kushina. The later waved, having already demolished the entire packet of treats she'd been handed. We're actually kind of here about your grandfather's jutsu. We were told there's one in particular that was sealed away here that you're guarding, the reanimation technique? Han had been mild and affable until this point, but barely a shift in his tone or expression, his mien had become much sharper and guarded. Why do you ask? We think someone could be using it. Han shook his head. That's impossible. The only man who could ever use it is dead and he never taught it to anyone else. The technique has been sealed away here in our vault for decades. You're sure no one's broken in? That's something I would have noticed. There has never been a break-in. So few people know the jutsu exists, let alone where it is. Well, could we see it? Make sure it hasn't been tampered with? I'm afraid not. The vault hasn't been opened in 50 years, and according to my grandfather's wishes, it'll stay closed forever. It's not the kind of power that should ever be unleashed. How do you know the jutsu is still in there if you've never opened it? Kushina asked. And are these all the biscuits you have? They were, yes, answered Han. And it stands to reason that if the vault has never been opened, the contents have never been removed. And you would definitely know if the vault has been opened? Definitely. Minato sighed inwardly. Senju Han was a little more stubborn than he'd anticipated. Could we see the vault? Tomorrow, the monk said. I can't show it to you in the middle of a blackout, you understand. You're welcome to rest here for the night, but after that I'd have to ask you to return to your village. This temple is at great risk of attack, and I wouldn't wish you to be caught up in danger. We're used to danger, Kushina told him. Even so. Han pushed himself to his feet. This is the coziest room in the temple, so I insist you sleep here tonight. I assume you brought your own bedding? All the blankets I smuggle into this place go missing thanks to my zealous little monklings, so I'm afraid I have nothing to offer. We'll be fine, thank you. Good. And, again, please refrain from any impure activity, Han said with a sigh. Not that it matters, but this is a celibate order and it's difficult to be reminded of the things we gave up. No worries there, Minato thought. Kushina looked only too happy to obey the rules of a celibate order of monks. Good night then, Han said, and his gaze lingered briefly on Minato before he removed himself from the room. Turning to Kushina, he asked, what do you think? Of Han? Complete flake, she said shortly. You don't like him? Oh, flakes don't bother me, or I wouldn't be dating you, would I? Kushina licked her finger and dabbed at the last crumbs inside the biscuit wrapper. I'm not sure about this vault though. He seems pretty sure no one's broken into it. He could be wrong, Minato suggested. A guy good enough to use a technique like that is probably good enough to break into the vault holding it without detection. Are you going to demand he open it tomorrow? She asked him. 'Cause it was sealed under a Hokage's orders, and I don't think you have the authority to overrule that. No, he agreed, but perhaps there was another way. They unrolled their sleeping bags by the fire and went through the same short rituals in preparation for sleep. Kushina brushed her hair and removed her equipment before settling inside her bag, but Minato was still a little too damp to retire. He remained seated, staring into the fire. You warm enough? She asked. We could share body heat? We'll be struck down by lightning. Didn't you hear the holy man? He remained quiet for a moment, but her light-hearted rebuffs had started to wear thin on him. You'd refuse even if he hadn't said anything, he pointed out. Well, of course. You're all cold and slimy. And if I wasn't? What's the big deal? She demanded, lifting her head to look at him. I'm tired. You're always tired, or you always need to wash your hair, or do the dishes, or you always remember there's an errand you need to run. It's all too convenient. You never in your life get headaches except for when we're together. Yeah, you're good at giving me headaches, she grumbled, shuffling down in her sleeping bag with her back to him. Is there something wrong? He asked. With me? Isn't it a little conceited for the most perfect guy in Konoha to fish for compliments? She shot back. Of course there's nothing wrong with you. I just want to know what the problem is. There's no problem. I only think you ought to really know and accept someone before you do those kinds of things together. And you think you don't me that well? But they'd known each other for years. Minato couldn't think of another person in the world he'd ever been more open and connected with. Maybe it's you who doesn't know me. I doubt that, he said, but Kushina merely shrugged and yawned. I'm going to sleep now, she murmured. Do what you like. A few minutes later her breathing had evened out, and if she wasn't asleep then at least she was determined to act like it. Minato had considered letting her in on his plan, but now he wasn't feeling quite so generous. He didn't like being blown off with lame excuses and reasons. If she feared intimacy or found it repulsive, or if she'd suddenly decided to become one of those people who wanted to save it for marriage, in case it was disastrous, presumably, he wouldn't have minded, as long as she told him so. Suggesting it was because he didn't really know her was like a kick in the shin bones. What was he supposed to do about that? He'd spent most of his life trying to get to know her from the first day she'd arrived in the village looking like an orphan princess, and he knew things about her now that few others knew about, secrets that, in the wrong hands, could get her killed. A secret another village had attempted to kidnap him for, and one he had laid his life down to protect. And she said this wasn't good enough? As silently as a shadow, Minato got up and pulled on his dry set of spare clothes. Leaving Kushina to her sleep, fake or otherwise, he slipped from the room with a spare candle to guide his way through the dark underground corridors. The temple and its hidden passages might as well have been a labyrinth during a blackout, but when Minato pressed his fingers to the stone walls and probed with chakra, he felt the general layout was smaller and simpler than he'd expected. 30 to 40 monks slept on this underground level, and above them the temple was deserted. The vault must have been up there, he thought, noticing a conspicuous area where his chakra couldn't penetrate. He found the stairs leading up to the temple's enclosed forecourt, where the smell of smoke from the distant forest fires was stronger than ever. But they wouldn't last much longer. Minato held out his hand and felt the first light droplets of rain land on his palm. Before morning there would be a downpour. Across the forecourt was the pagoda and the entrance of the monastic study hall. During the day it was no doubt a very impressive sight, but Minato's feeble little candle didn't light much beyond the end of his nose. The flame's halo bounced off the edges of a pair of stone guardians and a series of beautiful, unlit lanterns, but otherwise the large hall was empty. Minato crossed to the far end to the place his chakra couldn't penetrate, presented to his senses like a dark blot in an otherwise brightly illustrated picture. He pushed a painted screen carefully aside and stepped into the small alcove behind it. A set of stone-carved doors confronted him, held closed by one long stone pin with an ofuda paper circling it. Minato stood back and contemplated it carefully. Obviously trying to jiggle the pin loose was futile. The pin was stuck fast as if it were part of the door itself. Only the one who'd planted the ofuda would be able to undo a protective jutsu like that, and Minato suspected that was none other than Senjuhan. The cracks between the doors and their frame were just as impenetrable. Minato attempted to slip one of his paper tags between the thin gap, and the vault didn't take kindly to this. The paper met some kind of block and a moment later burst into flames in his hand. It rapidly curled away and dissolved into ashes while Minato sucked his fingers thoughtfully. It was a pity he didn't have someone like A on hand to simply punch it open, but then that would defy the point. If he was right, this vault had been opened in recent years, and whoever had done it had managed without leaving any evidence. However, the design of these protections were not the kind you could break through without leaving a lot of rubble in your wake. Then again, there were more ways to enter a house than the front door. He pressed his hand to the floor and once again let his chakra trickle through the framework of the temple. The vault was secure on all sides. It seemed, roughly the size of a closet, and directly beneath it lay one of the underground passages leading to the dormitory. Minato snatched up his candle and pulled the screen back into place before quickly retreating to the stairs. Keeping his hand up to stop the candle guttering out, he followed the quiet passages until he was sure he was beside the vault again, this time directly below it. The candlelight didn't reveal much. The rough, pockmarked ceiling cast all kinds of little flickering shadows, no different from any other part of the corridor. He needed to get closer, and so he placed the candle on the floor and lifted a foot to mount the wall. With his chakra to aid him, he climbed up to the ceiling and crouched there, upside down, running his fingers across its bumpy surface to probe for a weakness in the vault's defenses. His senses came up against the same solid wall, as if trying to insist there was nothing there at all. But where the entrance of the vault had been elaborately impenetrable, Minato thought he detected a pinprick in this flank. A tiny spot in the black canvas where light could shine through, so to speak. He moved his hand toward it and his fingertip brushed against a hole in the concrete. If he hadn't been looking for it, he would have missed it. In a ceiling full of dimples and dashes it was easy to overlook, but this hole had a peculiar symmetry to it. Perfectly round and not quite big enough to accommodate his little finger, he was sure it extended all the way up through the stone, possibly right into the vault itself. As a faint breeze blew down the corridor, threatening to extinguish his light, Minato got to work. He stretched out a length of wire and around one end he rolled one of his tags tightly. When the wire was charged with chakra it could become as straight and stiff as splint, and without further ado he guided it into the hole, maneuvering the tag through the stone, waiting for it to combust if and when it hit the protective barrier, or waiting for it to slide right through the defenses. Having trouble sleeping? Minato's fingers fumbled to a stop and he looked down. Senjuhan was standing beneath him in a sleeping yukata, hand tucked into his belt alongside a smoking pipe. More sacrilegious pollutants, no doubt. His expression was one of polite inquiry, but Minato reckoned it was no accident that he'd been caught almost red-handed. "That's the second time you've snuck up on me," he said. "And I promise I won't blast you through the air a second time as long as you give me an adequate explanation for why you are hanging upside down beneath my grandfather's vault with every appearance of trying to break into it." He scooped up the candle and held it aloft. "And please come down before you break your neck." Minato retracted his wire and dropped down to the floor. "I was trying to break into your vault, yes," he admitted. "Why?" "To prove it could be done." "How?" "Venturesome," Han remarked evenly. "I should have known a Namikaze wouldn't have been put off that easily." "And how did you go on?" "Not too bad," Minato said, "although I'm not the first person to try, and I'm pretty sure someone already succeeded before me." He pointed to the hole in the ceiling, and Han squinted up at it skeptically. "You didn't make that?" he asked. "It was like that when I got here." Han shook his head regretfully. "I suppose you think I have no choice but to open the vault now to check on the scrolls," he said. "Well, you'd be correct. We might as well get this over with." Minato followed him back through the passages to the temple forecourt. The sky was in full downpour now, but at least the sun's first early morning hues provided better light to see by. Han led him into the study hall and pushed aside the screen, and it was almost criminal how simply he dragged one finger over the Ofuta paper and its inscriptions vanished, along with all the protections sealing the vault. "I'll need your help," he said to Minato. "Two hands are better than one." Obligingly, Minato slid the pin free of its sockets and pulled open one door as Han dragged on the other. The vault yawned open before them, and the musty smell of dust and old parchment rolled out. Inside was a small pedestal, and upon the small pedestal lay a slim black scroll. "Is that it?" Minato asked him. Han's jaw had locked. "No," he said, reaching inside to take the scroll. "That isn't the reanimation scroll." Even with one hand he snapped it open with a flick of his wrist and held it close to the candle to read. Minato leaned closer, trying to peer over his shoulder. "What does it say?" "By the time you think to look here, it will be because I am long gone and my attempts were a success. The legacy of the Nidaime Hokage was not made to rot under lock and key. The world will know immortality once again. And as one extra act of blasphemy in this most holy of temples, the monk added his very heartfelt reaction. Fuck. The calling card may have put Senju Han out of sorts, but as far as Minato was concerned it was his first piece of good luck in a long time. It was certainly more than he could have hoped for when all he'd expected to find, at best, was an empty vault. While the monk stared forlornly at the place where his grandfather's scrolls should have been, Minato discreetly took the scroll from his limp fingers. "This is probably the same guy abducting people," he said, examining the message. "Do you have any idea when the techniques might have been taken?" Han didn't answer for a moment, as if he hadn't heard him. Minato was about to repeat the question when he suddenly spoke. "Any time between now and 50 years ago?" Han ran his hand over his face. "I only had one purpose left in life, and imagine that, I've failed it." "You can't blame yourself," Minato told him abstractedly. "I'm beginning to think this guy is on par with a Kage for how easily he outmaneuvers everyone. The protections on your vault were perfect. I should have noticed the break-in." Minato had already offered his token condolences and now he was more concerned with the scroll in his hand. The message had been handwritten with a distinctive style that he was almost sure he'd seen before. It wasn't much of a lead to go on, but it was better than nothing. The cryptography department back in Konoha had a handwriting analysis expert, if he recalled correctly, and it was about time she started utilizing her job title. Do you know why he would say the world will know immortality once again? That's the jutsu, isn't it? Han said, slowly pushing the vault doors shut again, though he didn't bother to lock them. It's a jutsu that cannot only bring the dead back to life, but restore their souls. Providing you sacrifice a life in return, you could bring back anyone as many times as you like. It's a very tempting prospect, isn't it? There are always people you would love to have back beside you once more, and far too many you would happily sacrifice to do so. It's evil even in the most well-intentioned hands, in the wrong hands you could resurrect armies. Seriously? Kushina hadn't been too far off the mark with her horror novel theory about zombie armies, not that he'd ever admit that out loud. Han shrugged and shook his head. So there you have it, he said, wandering away. I don't know what else to tell you. I expect you'll be heading back to Konoha in the morning? I expect so, yes. I can't say that I won't be relieved, Han said with a soft, humorless laugh. Well, now Minato just felt guilty. I'm sorry, he said. I know we've caused you a lot of grief coming here. Han raised his head to look him in the eye. You say that with a face like that, and you have no idea. He shook his head again and moved away to sit on the steps outside the hall, looking out at the rain hammering the courtyard. What do you mean? Minato asked him plainly. You're Midoriko's son, aren't you? Although the way Han asked made it clear he already knew the answer. I knew when you gave your name, should have realized it straight away when I saw your face. I don't know why, but even though it's been 20 years, I still expected you to be a child. Makes me realize how long it's been. Scroll in hand, Minato sat down on the steps beside him, looking at the monk more closely than he had since his arrival. Small lanterns and candles had never given him the whole picture, but now as morning approached and the new gray light filtered through the rain, Minato noticed what he hadn't before. Han was pale, from the tips of his hair to the ends of his fingers. Suddenly Minato knew where he'd seen him before. You were in my mother's team, he said in wonder. I thought you were dead. As good as. Han lifted his mutilated arm. The same battle that took my arm also took all my teammates, including your mother. I didn't really survive. I came here to die, but I fear I'm dragging it out a bit. Minato's mind exploded with questions. He'd never met anyone who had truly known his mother. Tsukumo had come close, but he didn't have many answers, and prying them loose was like extracting teeth from a tiger. As her teammate, Han must have known her well, only Minato didn't know where to start. So he asked the biggest question of all, what was she like? Han glanced sideways at him, confused. Your mother, he asked. You mean you don't know? My father wouldn't talk about her. No, he wouldn't. He was always a bitter, jealous little man who had trouble sharing her. So handsome when he was young, and witty, and charming, and I think your mother liked the security of marrying a civilian. She was the kind of woman who had 10 wedding proposals before breakfast, and at the time she seemed happiest with him. It was a mistake, if you'll forgive me for saying so. He never forgave her for not devoting herself completely to him, and he blamed me for her death. Well, he was probably right about that. What's he up to these days? Oh. Minato scuffed the heel of his sandal against the stone steps. He died. Han slipped his pipe from his belt and put it between his lips as he lit it with a lighter. Only after his first drag did he say, with complete and utter insincerity, what a shame. That nettled Minato a little, though he couldn't explain why. He didn't particularly care for his father, but he liked observing simple respect for the dead. Or perhaps it was more that his father's death had sparked a time of deep uncertainty and upheaval for Minato, and it was hard to brush it all off as a shame. Why did he blame you for her death? Minato asked him. Then he never even told you how she died? I know that she died on a mission in the line of duty, Minato said, though neglected to mention this was because he'd looked up her service record at one time. If you can call it that. It had nothing to do with our mission, we had completed it and we were on our way back. It happened so close to Konoha, we were just a stone's throw away from the gate. A man stopped us and confronted us. He spoke to me and said, no, I don't remember what he said anymore. All I remember is his mask. It only had one eye hole, you know, and we just assumed he was an idiot or a madman. Then he struck, and he killed Chihiro, and Goro. Then he killed Midoriko. Han stopped, lowering his pipe to his lap. She was tipped to be the first female Hokage of Konoha, and she could take even me down in 15 seconds if she put her mind to it. And this guy broke her neck like it was nothing. He could have just as easily killed me, he should have, but all he took was my arm. I think he wanted me to live with the loss. He took their lives and my livelihood because of what they meant to me, and I can't imagine a more appalling reason to die. Minato couldn't speak for a moment. It was true. Dying in the line of duty at least had some nobility, but dying just to cause grief? Just to make a point? Was that all his mother's life had come to? Who, he demanded. Who did that? You think we didn't search? Han asked him. A man like that appears only when he wants to be found. I could have consumed my life with a search for vengeance, but I knew even then that we were chasing a phantom. We never found out who was responsible. As for why? A man with a grudge against the Senju, perhaps, and there are plenty of those to pick and choose from. Who really knows why? It was a meaningless slaughter. I've brought up bad memories, Minato said apologetically. The only reason I keep living is to carry them with me. It's not your fault. Han reassured him. I remember your mother every day. It's good to talk about her again. Minato tilted his head. He supposed it wasn't that an odd confession to make, but something about the way he said it implied there was more to it than that. You were close to her. Best friends. Han nodded. Then, did you know who her lover was? Aren't you blunt, murmured Han, appraising him. Even the best of friends keep secrets from one another. I know what you're really asking, but as far as the law is concerned you are her husband's child, and that was that. Is that all you can tell me? Minato asked a little desperately. After all these years I was hoping for something a little more definitive. A life without definition is a free life. Or maybe you were her lover. Minato said it before he could stop himself. Ever since he'd seen the photograph of his mother's team in the academy he'd wondered why Tsukumo had directed him there. But if the boy in the picture was his father and was as long dead as Kakashi believed him to be, then his search for an answer was a fruitless one. But here was the man in question, who turned to look at him slowly with a troubled expression. Your mother was a loyal, faithful woman and her husband didn't deserve her. But if you believe the cruel things he said about her, you're buying into his paranoid delusions and disrespecting her memory. Put it out of your mind. It saddens me that such lies overshadow her legacy. She deserved better than to die as she did, and she deserves better than for her son to think she was an adulterer. Minato let out a slow breath. So you're saying, my father was actually my father? A novel idea, isn't it? Han smiled at him. But reassuring, no? That wasn't how Minato would describe a revelation that he really did share half his genes with a violent drunk. Is that really true? He asked, scowling deeply. Why would I lie? Han asked, holding his palm out in a gesture of honesty. Because there's about 20 years' worth of child support and pocket money you owe me, Minato pointed out. Han laughed and nodded. True. That would be a good reason. But since I took a vow of poverty, which I'm sure you take as seriously as your other vows. Han sighed and shrugged. You know, you don't just look like her, you talk like her too. If she could see me today she wouldn't let me get away with such things either, but at least I think she would be proud of you. I was teasing you earlier, I've heard of you before. Everyone here knows who the Yellow Flash is, even if I never connected it with Midoriko's son until now. I would claim you in a heartbeat if it was my right to do so, but it's not. Absently, Minato looked down at the scroll in his hand, having almost forgotten its contents and what it meant. Han nodded to it, and said, You've got what you came for. Isn't that enough? Still, Minato couldn't help but feel a little like someone had tried to yank the rug from beneath his feet, not so much that he had fallen, but for a brief moment he'd thought the answer to his paternity was staring him in the face. Instead he was now wondering if the drunk man who called him bastard more often than Minato had really been his father all along, and this mistrust he'd had in his wife had been an unfounded delusion. At the very least he now felt he had some kind of human connection to his mother, someone who had known her personally and was willing to speak of her, even if he half wished he hadn't asked how she'd died. He would have tried to ask Han more but the monk seemed like he was still a little dismayed over the vault's infiltration, and Minato didn't have the heart to keep pushing. His mother may have been a figure of mild curiosity to him, but to someone like Han, she was evidently a much more sensitive subject. Crossing the forecourt through the rain, Minato slipped away with the black scroll, back down into the underground passages where he'd left Kushina. The fire had died in his absence, but its heat still warmed the room and made his rain-chilled skin shiver. Kushina, in true form, had somehow escaped her sleeping bag and was now sprawled across his two. He stood beside her for a moment, listening to her faint snores and wondering if he should wake her. There was some pressing matters she ought to know. For instance, he could shake her shoulder and say, "Hey, Kushina, guess what? I just accused a stranger of being my father." Or maybe the discovery of this scroll in the vault was a more pressing point. Crouching down, he touched her shoulder. "Kushina." "MMGH," she grunted. "Swarm, few more mints." It was nothing that couldn't wait until morning, and so Minato decided to lie down and hopefully catch a little sleep before Senju Han came to shoo them out of his temple. Almost at once Kushina turned and folded her arm around him, pinning his shoulder to the floor with her head. "Cold and slimy." She sighed contentedly. Minato knew he'd have to give up on any thought of sleep, but at least he felt a little bit better now that he could relax and stroke his fingers through Kushina's hair for as long as he wanted. The hills were black. The Haiu Valley was known to be one of the greenest, most verdant bowls of land in the country, and now on the east side of the river lay a patchwork of smoking, charred strips of land. When they left the temple and saw the effects of last night's forest fires for the first time in daylight, they were a little stunned. Kushina, who had once protested her own unit's tactics of destroying habitat to fight off waterfall forces, stood staring in disgust. "It's going to take years to recover," she said to him. "And what good has it done anyway? It's so short-sighted." There was nothing either of them could do, so they set off back along the same trail they'd followed the previous day, tracing the river east towards Konoha. The smell of smoke hung thickly in the air as they descended the hills away from the temple, and though they had what they'd come for, strong evidence that their theory was correct, Minato wished he'd had a little time longer to speak with Han. But the monk seemed more eager to see the back of him than to further discuss his past, and Minato had to respect that. The man had come here in part to escape it. Although he usually told Kushina everything, for once he kept his revelations to himself. They were too personal, he thought, though he wondered if he wasn't just feeling a little snubbed after her comments the previous night about how well he knew her. "You're being awfully quiet," Kushina said after a while, glancing at him curiously. "Am I?" They'd spent most of the journey to the temple in silence, and only now that bothered her? "Yes. You're thinking too hard, I can tell." She pointed to between her eyes, indicating that he'd been frowning. She had once told him that his default expression was one of a man whose head was filled with air and serenity, so if he didn't look anything like a tranquilized mental patient, something had to be up. "It's this scroll," he said, forcefully switching his mind back onto the subject he should have been worrying about. "I don't know how much use it's going to be. The analyst in Konoha might not be able to tell us much. Give it here." He handed it into her outstretched hand and she unraveled it smartly, looking at the words as if she were a studious scholar. He knew she was anything but. "Looks like a woman wrote it," she said. "How could you possibly tell that?" he demanded, exasperated with the way she plucked these theories of hers out of thin air. She gave him an incredulous scowl. "It's obvious," she exclaimed. "Look at these loopy, slanting characters. It screams meekness and femininity." He took the scroll back. "It reads like an egomaniacal psychopathic with an overly dramatic flourish," he pointed out. "Egomaniacal psychopaths and femininity are not mutually exclusive," she retorted. "And don't say it." "Say what?" "That I'm a perfect example," she huffed. "Of course not," he said. "There's nothing feminine about you." "Ooh," she hissed, eyes narrowing to slits. Minato turned away so she wouldn't see the terrible smirk breaking across his face, and almost at once he felt a weight land on his back as arms looped around his neck. Kushina's hair splayed across his cheek and her mouth nudged his ear. You sure about that? Well, there was no denying the soft parts of her squashed against his back that were making his face feel rather hot and flushed, but Minato continued walking in resilience. His feet sank a little deeper into the moss with the added weight of his girlfriend. Pretty sure, yep. Her teeth nipped his ear. You sure you're sure? Kushina. He dropped her to the ground and whirled on her, though she was a picture of wide-eyed innocence. You're a real pervert, you know that, right? She looked off into the trees like an easily distracted child while he self-consciously rubbed his ear. There's a time and a place for that kind of thing, and since the last time this happened I got shot by a jet of water with extreme prejudice, maybe you should be more considerate towards me? At once Kushina darted forward and tackled him into a bed of ferns. Minato had barely the breath to gasp in shock when her hand clapped over his mouth. From the way she pressed a finger to his lips, he figured she wasn't trying to be kinky, she was trying to keep him quiet. After a moment he heard it too, the faint thrash of bracken as something lumbered through the undergrowth. You have ears like a bat, he whispered to her. What is that? There were all kinds of wild animals in these woods and most of them were deadly. In Minato's experience the ones you had to watch out for were the small, poisonous ones like the snakes and the spiders. The larger animals like tigers and the occasional forest rhinoceros were pretty deadly in their own right, but easy enough to avoid. Hardly call to dive into the bushes like frightened rabbits. He almost thought it an overreaction on Kushina's part, until he heard the voices. Then he had to amend his previous assessment that she had ears like a bat, Kushina had ears like a bat with a hangover. He gently pushed her off him and rose up slightly to look over the fallen log they'd landed beside. In the far distance through the thickest growth of trees he could see movement. Sandy uniforms, the color of parched rock, flickered in and out of sight, accompanied by the rolling black pelt of something much bigger moving amongst them. "Iwa Neen," he whispered. "That's got to be a summon," Kushina whispered back. "What do we do?" "They're heading east," he said, which was precisely the same direction they were going. "We'll have to stop them." "There's, 20 of them," Kushina sighed. "Not including that giant summon they've got." Minato nodded. "That's fine. 10 for you, 10 for me. And between us I'm sure we can take down that monster." Kushina snorted indelicately. "How about 20 for you and I'll deal with that summon?" "Think you can manage it?" he asked, surprised. She gave him a look that strongly suggested he take his concern elsewhere before she told him to shove it in a very uncomfortable place. So maybe he could be a little patronizing sometimes, quite unintentionally, but this time he felt it was a little warranted. Even he would think twice before taking on a full-sized summon. "Needle formation?" he asked her. They waited until the bulk of the group was moving away from them before they hunched low and circled around them from behind to close in. The estimate of 20 wasn't far off. Up close, Minato counted 18, but the summon gave him pause. Larger and hairier than a mammoth, it seemed to mostly consist of one enormously bushy tail, until by chance it swung its head to the side and he caught sight of a long, tubular nose. An anteater. Not the most ferocious-looking of animals, but the curved claws it walked on like sharpened, steel knuckles could easily tear a man apart if he got too close. Or a woman for that matter. Minato glanced worriedly at Kushina, she returned it with a huff of determination. He gave the signal. At once Kushina drew back, allowing Minato to charge ahead. Grabbing kunai from their holsters, he fell upon the man bringing up the rear, smashing him face first into the ground. His cry of alarm and pain alerted his comrades who turned, too slowly, and the closest 3 jerked back as Minato's kunai found their mark in each of their throats. A shout rose instantly above the crunching trundle of the summon. "It's Konoha!" Shuriken whistled through the air and struck the ground where Minato had been standing. He rolled to a stop on one knee. Behind him, Kushina shot into sight, her feet flying through the ferns before landing squarely on his shoulder, and as he rose she jumped, leaping through the air to land halfway up the summit's mountainous rump. It was beginning to react to the attack, but like most beasts its size it was difficult to maneuver in thick forest cover. "There's only 2 of them," someone shouted. "Stop the girl." The IWA Nin turned to aim their attacks at Kushina. Minato dodged forward, released a streaming wind jutsu that knocked over enough men to distract the rest, giving Kushina enough time to scramble up on top of the mammoth creature and almost out of sight. A thick hand seized Minato's wrist as another plowed into his stomach, bending him double. Outnumbered. He was definitely outnumbered. He kicked up his leg to crack his foot against his attacker's head, but not a moment later he was thrown back, the earth underneath him ejecting him like a spring. "The girl! Stop the girl!" A strangled yowl filled the air as the summon thrashed, sweeping its tail across the clearing it had made. IWA Nin flew left and right, and Minato sprang into a tree, out of range. What was she doing to that thing? He paused a moment to look across at her, straddling the back of the anteater and performing some kind of jutsu with one hand as she clung on for dear life with the other. But the IWA Nin who had not been bowled aside didn't let up. One picked up a stone and threw it at him, easy enough to dodge if it hadn't splintered into tiny bullet-like fragments. Minato grabbed a tagged kunai and leapt clear, and as he fell towards the group that prepared to meet him with all their sharp, shiny weapons, he twisted in midair and threw the kunai up into the sky as hard as he could. The IWA Nin may have been astonished that the man readily falling on their swords suddenly vanished. In truth, Minato was still falling. As the kunai he threw reached its zenith in the sky, he appeared and caught it, and before he could fall too far he threw it again, higher still. The clearing retreated below, until he could look down upon the giant anteater among the trees where it looked no bigger than a rodent thrashing around in the grass. As he began to fall back to earth he had time to gather the tagged kunai from his pouch and throw a handful ahead of him. They would strike the ground before he did, but not by much, and the IWA Nin were waiting for him. With a final scream the anteater rose up on its hind legs and swung its forearms wide, severing trees all around it with its scythe-like claws. Kushina tumbled down its back, dismounted, but whatever she had done worked and a moment later the great summon vanished, leaving the clearing much sparser. The ground rushed closer to Minato, but his kunai landed first with a hail of thuds. There. The men waiting for him witnessed his disappearance yet again. But this time they were too late. Flash. Minato struck one from behind, jamming his parrying kunai into his spine and ripping it sideways. Flash. Before the first even realized he was fatally injured, Minato struck another, puncturing the back of his skull and swung around to stab a third in the stomach. Flash. He leapfrogged over Kushina to slash the throat of the man she'd tripped behind her. Flash. He snapped the neck of a man standing at the edge of the clearing and threw two kunai hard and true into the backs of a pair who were still staring at the last place he'd appeared. The clearing was being decimated. 18 men were reduced in seconds and Kushina had stopped dead in the middle of it, listening to one cry after another as their enemy fell. The last of them was rightly terrified but was standing too far out of range of Hiration for Minato to sneak up on. Tossing his kunai aside, Minato selected a new one that wasn't quite so slippery with blood and stalked towards his final target with the single-minded purpose of a clean finish. This last enemy would no longer resist. He'd been utterly demoralized and horrified with the rapid elimination of his team, and now as he saw Minato coming towards him his legs failed and he attempted to crawl backwards, stuttering pleas and holding his hands out in supplication. Minato wasn't cruel. He lifted his hand, intending to strike him dead with one blow of the kunai between his eyes. He was stopped when the two hands he loved seized him by the arm and pulled him up short. He paused and looked down at Kushina's stark white face. "What are you doing?" she demanded. He blinked. "What?" "He's begging for mercy," she cried out. Minato looked at the IWA Nin. If he had been begging for mercy, he had now taken Kushina's timely interruption as a cue to escape and was now scrambling away over the lumpy terrain like a man running from hell itself. He's getting away, Minato pointed out patiently. He's going to rejoin the rest of his forces, regroup, and tell them what? Kushina threw her hands wide. Minato, you killed them all. It was necessary, it's mindless, she shouted. You didn't have to do this. We could have stunned them and destroyed their gear, forcing them to retreat. Taking twice the risk and the effort so that they can return to fight another day? He scoffed at her. Afraid you can't handle that? That's not a reasonable solution, Kushina, this is war. She gave a growl of frustration and shoved him in the chest, forcing him back a step. Slaughter is not reasonable. You're making sure it definitely becomes a war by doing things like this. You of all people have the choice of mercy and you throw it away because you think this is neater. She gestured at the clearing. Blood was saturating the earth now, and those who weren't already dead were close to it, and their last rattling gasps and splutters as their bodies failed were quite the opposite of neat. He shook his head. You're too much of an idealist. And you're warped, she shot back. I'm a shinobi, and so are you in case you've forgotten. This is what we do. Bull. I've never met two people who could agree on the purpose of a shinobi. This is just what you've chosen to do. You don't give a damn about anyone, so it doesn't matter to you that these men are not wooden targets, or that they have families, or that they might be conscripts, or wishing they were somewhere else. It doesn't matter to you that one day it might be you who needs the mercy you deny everyone, or that every person you kill might lead another to vengeance against you. If you agree to go on missions with me, you agree to play by my rules, he said shortly. I don't care if you want to pick up everyone I knock down, you don't tell me how to do my job and I won't tell you to stop being such a wet blanket. I think you just did, she snarled. This isn't up for debate, he told her. If you don't want to kill, why did you even become a shinobi? Because where I come from, a shinobi is synonymous with protector, not killer, she lectured. And what the hell do you want to become Hokage for if you're just going to keep up the same old feuds? You told me you wanted peace, but this isn't how you buy peace. He frowned at her. What would you know about peace? You're telling me to follow Whirlpool's example when they turned on one another and slaughtered their own people? Real superior, huh? Kushina folded her arms tightly across her chest and stared glassily at him. I'm not going to talk to you anymore, she said with quiet finality. Thank heavens for small mercies, he thought unkindly, although when Kushina chose to sulk she could do so for a very long time. You do that, he said. In the meantime, will you at least help me check over the bodies before we go on? There might be something useful among them. Even if Kushina wasn't willing to talk to him, she carried out his orders, reluctantly picking over the corpses and prodding them with her toes. Her mood worsened naturally, as she came across their totems of loved ones and homes, and in the end there was nothing of use to be found. They left the bodies for the crows or their comrades, whichever came first, and continued homeward in fuming silence. The first coffins had already arrived before them. They had planned to head straight for the Hokage Tower to present their findings to the Hokage, but the sight of the caskets lined up just inside the gate made them pause. There were 6 in total. More were sure to come. When Minato spoke to one of the jonin standing over them, he learned he too had been in the Hayu Valley last night. The forest fires were set by IWA, the jonin said. They like to clear the land before they take it so they have the territorial advantage. We were ambushed and outnumbered, and as of now they've taken the west side of the valley. The Hokage figured as much. But hopefully they won't cross the river before we've mustered more manpower. And girl power, Kushina reminded. The jonin ignored her. It's going to take everything we've got just to push them back into the neutral region. If Kumo attacks now, it hasn't come to that yet. Minato interrupted. He found no use in worrying about things that hadn't happened yet. We'll recoup. That's easy for you to say. Yajuri's team was completely wiped out. The man wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. It wasn't hot, but he was sweating nonetheless. It's a complete mess. We're too unprepared. Negativity won't help, at least. Even from one jonin to another. You know the stakes as well as I do. Some chunin are known for their long ears, he said, glancing back at Kushina who was staring at them unrepentantly. Yeah, well she can thank her sensei for this, said the jonin, giving her one decidedly dirty look. These deaths are on his head. Kushina's mouth dropped open, and her gasp of outrage was very audible. If Minato didn't intercede, he had no doubt he would witness a repeat of the last time someone had insulted Tsukumo, and he wasn't in the mood to pick up teeth from the ground right now. This wasn't Tsukumo's fault, Minato said shortly. You should know better. You may be a jonin, but you're still a kid, the jonin snapped. The White Fang threw the mission to save a couple of necks and now they have paid for it, he jabbed his finger at the coffins in emphasis. Iwa's invasion was inevitable, Minato said. Their collusion with Kyumo was not. Our forces are split thin because we got the word earlier this morning that Kyumo troops have been seen moving through the mountains towards our border. If you think they're not going to attack, you're crazy. Minato started. We need to block the pass. Having spent 2 years in those mountains, he knew them like the back of his hand. Working out contingency plans in the event of an invasion had occupied most of his time up there. It's already being worked on. You see, some of us have actually been working, not skipping around the countryside visiting temples. Minato met the jonin's eye steadily before he turned and walked away without another word. Kushina immediately fell into step beside him. You shouldn't let him talk to you like that, she told him. They'll never respect you. He shrugged. 6 people are dead. I think it's understandable he's a little upset right now. Way more than 6 people are dead, but I guess we're not counting the ones who aren't from Konoha, she said pointedly, and then her shoulders slumped in something a little more despairing. This isn't Sensei's fault. I know, he sighed, reaching out to cross his arm around her shoulder and pull her close, their earlier tiff forgotten. People are scared right now, but they'll see clearly soon. Kushina twisted her bottom lip between her fingers worriedly. I should go see him, let him know we're back. You think he's heard about these deaths? Minato asked her. I don't know, but if he has, she broke off and shook her head. Everyone's going to be hard on him for this, but that's nothing compared to how hard Sensei is on himself. I'll meet you later. You'll tell me what the Hokage says about the scroll? Sure. And if you see Kakashi, tell him I'll be mentoring him from now on. He forced a smile and a friendly wave as she left, but the moment she was gone he privately heaved a sigh. Kushina wasn't a worrier by nature, but the way she spoke about Tsukumo now made her sound like an overly anxious daughter to a sick father. Their colleagues were taking their frustration at a potentially hopeless situation out on the man for a mistake that at any other time would have landed him with letters of commendation. Not everyone blamed him, but enough. In desperate times even the most cohesive fighting force could split along ideological lines, between those who demanded life be prioritized at all costs, and those saw the value in sacrificing a few for a mission to save many. There were more of the latter than Minato had ever realized. The Hokage had been wrong to bend to their fear and hatred, however. Barring one of their best jonin from service did not protect Konoha, and it certainly did no comfort to Tsukumo. Kushina would do her best to cheer him up, but something had to be done. It was an injustice as far as Minato was concerned, and as Tsukumo had once said, if he was not angered or motivated by injustice, what good was he? If only Minato knew how to help. He didn't have the power to change people's opinions with a wave of his hand, and he didn't think Kushina's approach of simply beating sense into them had done much good so far. When he arrived at the Hokage's office and announced himself to the aide, he was waved straight through. He realized why when he saw the man standing with the Hokage behind his desk. Ah, and here he is now. Jiraiya beamed at him proudly. Sensei was just telling me what the hell's been biting Orochimaru for the past week. Minato paused. Excuse me? See? He's so polite, Jiraiya nudged the Hokage. You made the right choice. Much better than Oro-chan. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, said the Hokage, raising his hands as if that might slow down his student. I do recall saying my decision hung on whether or not Minato could prove himself. Speaking of which, do you have anything for me? Minato nodded and presented the black scroll, rolling it open on the desk between them. I found this in the vault where the Nidame's forbidden scrolls should have been. They're missing and this was found in its place. Jiraiya and the Hokage bent to examine it, respectively confused and curious. Minato could see the Hokage's lips move as he read the words over before he uttered them faintly beneath his breath. The world will know immortality once again. Minato? What is this? Jiraiya asked, scratching his shaggy head. The thief left it behind, and I'm pretty sure this is the same guy behind the abductions. Still on about that, huh? Jiraiya gave him a sideways smirk. Minato returned it. It's important, sensei. Konoha's important, Jiraiya corrected, moving into teacher mode. If Kyumo or IWA have a problem with this guy, they should be hunting him themselves. Innocent lives matter, wherever they happen to be born, Minato said, although the conviction in his tone had begun to fade. Hadn't he just wiped out nearly 20 IWA nin today without hesitation or question, for the simple fact that they had been on the wrong side of the border? To his own ears he sounded like a hypocrite. But it's different, he told the part of himself that had begun to sound like Kushina when she wasn't around. They weren't innocent. Even so, Jiraiya was impressed. See, sensei? He comes out with gems like that all the time, and sometimes I think he even believes them. The Hokage didn't appear to be listening. He had picked up the thin parchment of the scroll and was gazing at it with a frown of deep consternation. Immortality, he muttered to himself, something strange and painful flickering across his face. This writing. Sensei? Jiraiya called, noticing he'd withdrawn. Yes. Hem. The Hokage sat down and rolled the scroll shut with one efficient stroke. Thank you for your service, Minato. I think it's time to release you from this obligation. You should rejoin the other Jonin and report to the administration office for deployment. Minato blinked rapidly, taken aback. But I thought you wanted me to find this guy. I think I'll take it from here, Sarutobi explained. With all due respect, Hokage-sama, you're very busy right now. I don't think you'll have the time to complete the investigation, and apart from this note I'm not much closer. You've done enough, the Hokage interrupted sternly. You've been of great help, but I will take things from here. Please do not trouble yourself with this matter any further. Now, I have a meeting in a few minutes, so if you both don't mind. Jiraiya shrugged and headed for the door. Minato stayed rooted to the spot. But I need to debrief you about an IWA team I met. You can debrief the strategists at the administration office. At times of war, Jonin are no longer required to report every little incident to the Hokage. The Hokage was pulling paperwork toward him, making it perfectly clear Minato's time was running short. I was hoping to speak to you about Hatake Tsukumo as well. I'm holding off the demotion for as long as I can, but I can make no promises. No, Hokage-sama, he should be on the mission roster. He doesn't deserve to be grounded. This is not the time, Minato. The Hokage shouted, slamming his hand down on the desk, silencing the younger Jonin in an instant. Minato had never witnessed him lose his temper, and from the way Jiraiya paused in the doorway, it was a revelation to him too. I have been through this with you and every other complainer. If I'm not being told to throw him out the village, I'm being told to give him a gold medal, and there are more important things at stake right now. Tsukumo must wait. Now please leave. Chastened, Minato bowed stiffly and followed Jiraiya out. His sensei ruffled his hair compassionately as the door all but kicked them on the way. Don't feel bad, kid, he said. We lost some good people last night, and hearing his sensei's technique was stolen of all things, well, that's probably the last thing he wanted to hear right now. Do you think he'll really follow up on this lead? Minato asked, not too confident of the way he'd been rapidly dismissed. After this guy stole his own sensei's jutsu? Jiraiya puffed up his cheeks and blew out a sigh. He'll catch him. It's personal now. Well, when he put it like that. I'm going to find Kushina, Minato told him. Kushina. Why am I not surprised? Jiraiya looked at him wryly. If there were 2 people more joined at the hip, I'm not sure I'd want to know. She's my best friend, Minato said, shrugging, and I told her I'd keep her up to date. Sure, grunted Jiraiya, but enjoy your manhood while it lasts. She'll take it from you eventually, all women do if you let them. Minato had to roll his eyes. Right, sensei, I'll keep that in mind. Oh, and speak of the Devulus herself, grinned Jiraiya, pointing. Look who, hey, what she got there. Kushina was hurrying towards them across the street, calling Minato's name. In her arms she carried a heavy bundle of what appeared to include her own vest, and as she drew closer Minato realized she was holding a small child. What's going on? He asked her, as she all but ran into them in her haste. I was going to Sensei's house, she explained in a rush, out of breath. I passed the timber yard, saw her, I thought she was asleep, but when I tried to wake her, look. Kushina pulled aside the vest she had wrapped around the small girl, showing him the alarming bright streak of blood running from her neck and soaking her front. Her skin was pallid and rubbery to look at, and Kushina was almost as pale. She won't wake up and I can barely feel a pulse, she said. We have to get her to the hospital. Give her here, commanded Jiraiya, scooping the girl out of her arms as if she weighed little more than the clothes she was wrapped in. What would I give to have Tsunade back right about now? Come on. Quickly. With his long strides, Jiraiya was difficult to keep up with once he got going. Minato hurried after him. Who is she? He asked Kushina. Was she attacked or, I don't know, she said, shaking her head emphatically. I just found her like that, but I know who she is. I've seen her before. Enko, Jiraiya tossed over his shoulder. She's Orochimaru's student. His student, repeated Minato. He had to admit that once they reached the hospital, Minato found himself a little redundant. The emergency unit was brimming with the men and women who had returned from last night's incursion with injuries ranging from light abrasions to serious internal bleeding. There was hardly a bed to spare, let alone a doctor, but Jiraiya was known to have a very commanding presence. He towered over everyone else in the unit, and when a medic attempted to duck around him, Jiraiya collared him easily. This girl needs help, he said. The medic attempted to back away. I already have 3 patients I need to, now. It was Kushina this time, proving she could just as easily rival the commanding power of a giant Sannin like Jiraiya. Minato wondered if it was already too late. The girl hadn't made a sound or so much as moved the whole way to the hospital, and as the medic laid her down on a gurney and began the first rudimentary examinations, there didn't seem to be much life left in her. She has a pulse, said the medic a little helplessly. Where are this girl's parents? She doesn't have any, said Jiraiya. Orochimaru is the closest thing she has to a guardian, I suppose. He should be brought here immediately, the medic said, delicately swabbing the wound on the little girl's neck. What's happened to her? Kushina asked anxiously. The medic pushed up his glasses, peering close at his patient. She has puncture wounds on her neck. Bitten? I wonder, what are these marks? The 3 ninja leaned forward curiously. Amidst the drying blood and the two oozing holes in her neck were other marks that Minato might have mistaken for bruises, except they were too regular. 3 marks, forming a ring around the broken skin, like commas. "That's a triple tomo," said Minato. "A ninjutsu mark?" Kushina's eyes snapped up to his. "Someone did this to her?" The medic's hand glowed with a faint yellow chakra as he moved it over the wound. "As far as I can tell, it feels like some kind of venomous chakra. I've never seen anything like it, but it's spreading from this mark," he said. "Can't you stop it?" Kushina asked, hesitantly reaching out to run a comforting hand over the girl's head, though it was doubtful she could feel anything. "Antivenoms won't work against a jutsu," said Jiraiya grimly. "A ninjutsu that imitates poison is something that can only be stopped if it's removed, but I suppose only the person who did this to her could undo it." "Could it be sealed?" Minato suggested. Jiraiya winced. "Maybe. I don't know any sealing techniques that would work, Minato, and the only person I can think of who might is the Hokage, and he's a tad busy right now." Kushina had been listening to their exchange quietly, and as they lapsed into baffled silence, she finally spoke up. "I think I could do it." The medic adjusted his glasses incredulously. Jiraiya simply stared. Minato tilted his head. "What?" he said faintly. "A seal to contain chakra?" she asked. "I think I can do that." "Since when?" Minato was pretty familiar with most of Kushina's jutsu, as well as her style. Surely he would have heard before now if she was proficient with seals, something that was more academically demanding than he thought Kushina was interested in. "My father was the best master of sealing techniques in the world," she said, somewhat archly at his blatant disbelief. "I know some of his work. But I thought you said his work was—" He stopped himself short, knowing they weren't alone. The fact that her father's techniques had been sealed in her was a village secret, and it was something she had sworn never to undo. Had she gone back on that? It seemed unlikely that she'd picked up any of her father's techniques as a small child before the man had died and she had arrived in Konoha. If she'd learnt them recently. Why hadn't she told him? "I can do this," she said again. "I just need some time and space and, privacy." "Are you sure, Kushina?" Jiraiya asked her, uncertain but not as if he desperately mistrusted her, which was rather generous, Minato thought. "I can only seal the chakra and I don't know if it would save her, but I want to try." "Can you really do this?" Minato cut in again. "I've never seen you use sealing jutsu." "How did you think I dealt with that summon?" she asked in response. "I used a contract seal to break its contract with the summoner and dismissed it myself." "But you said you would never release your father's techniques. When did you learn these things?" "I'll tell you later, okay?" she said quietly. Jiraiya clapped his hand on Minato's shoulder. "Come on, let's give her some privacy and I'll go inform Orochimaru about what's happened," he said. "Minato," Kushina called after him. "Could you go see Sensei? Tell him I'm back and I'll come by later." "I really don't think he'd want to see me," Minato mumbled. She clasped her hands together for him. "Please. Just keep him company." Then she turned away and began dictating her demands to the bemused medic. "I'll need a bigger room, and a brush, and you'll have to go away too." She appeared to know what she was doing and Jiraiya was already dragging him out by that vice-like grip on his shoulder. "Sometimes I wonder if I really know her," Minato sighed. "Yes, well," Jiraiya shrugged, for once not interested in commenting on the mysterious ways of women. "I need to find Orochimaru. That bastard is supposed to be looking after her, not leaving her to run wild. I'll have to inform the Hokage as well. If she was attacked by Iwa Nin, then we can safely say there are already spies in the village. And if it wasn't Iwa Nin? Damn it, what's going on? I'd come with you, but... Tsukumo. Yes, I know. She's right, you should go check on him. She's really worried about him, Minato agreed. With good reason. I'd go see him myself if not for this, Jiraiya said, shaking his shaggy head sadly. But be careful around him, Minato. This is a very difficult time for him. I'll catch up to you later, Minato waved and headed off. He'd been assigned a mission, and a simple one, check on Tsukumo and keep his spirits up. Yet the whole way his head was full of other concerns, the Hokage's reaction to the scroll, the coffins by the gate, that poor girl whose life was now potentially in Kushina's hands, and Kushina herself. Sealing techniques were difficult and required immense study before they could be implemented. When had she the time to learn these things? Was she teaching herself or was she being tutored? Tsukumo seemed a possible bet, but then Minato had always wondered what it was Kushina got up to when she had clandestine appointments with the Hokage's wife, Biwako. It shouldn't have bothered him as much as it did. Kushina was not obligated to inform him about everything she got up to, though it shook Minato's confidence that he was the one person who knew her better than anyone else. These days he was getting the increasing feeling that Kushina simply did not trust him as completely as he trusted her. Minato made an effort to put his worries aside when he reached Tsukumo's house, because compared to this man's problems, his own seemed pretty trifling. What Tsukumo needed now was a friend, and although Minato was quite sure he was the last person on earth Tsukumo would consider a friend, he felt he owed it to him. It was him who had recovered the intel that had led Tsukumo to take his mission, and perhaps if Minato had taken everyone's advice to back down and let them handle it, Tsukumo wouldn't be in disgrace right now. Or maybe they would have attempted to storm Kumo's base and been slaughtered by A. Every decision came with risks, he knew that. It was easy to blame yourself when things went wrong, but he couldn't fall into the same trap as Tsukumo and take every consequence upon himself. The front door was slightly ajar when Minato came to it, and he knocked on it politely as he pushed it open. "Anyone home?" he called cheerfully, stepping onto the creaking floorboards of the threshold. "Sakumo-sensei? Kakashi?" He received no reply. The house was unnaturally still, and he wondered if they'd gone out or he'd caught Tsukumo asleep in bed. His gaze roved the hall and he called again, this time up the stairs. When still no one replied, he began to turn around in confusion. Surely they wouldn't have gone out and left the door open like that. Then through the archway into the living room he saw Kakashi. The boy was sitting against the wall, looking at something across the room out of Minato's line of sight, so completely motionless and silent that Minato could have looked right at him and still missed him if he was a less attentive person. "Kakashi," he called, a smile breaking out across his face. "Are you deaf or something? Why didn't you answer me?" Kakashi turned his dark eyes slowly to Minato and offered no greeting or explanation. He simply sat listlessly, clutching something in his lap. "What have you got there?" Minato asked him, crossing the archway into the living room. He stopped dead when the sweet stink of human blood and offal hit him. Close enough now, he could see that the thing Kakashi held was a dagger, its blade coated with the same sticky red blood that covered Kakashi's knees and hands. And as if Minato wasn't there, Kakashi's eyes slipped from him again, returning to what had previously occupied his attention. Minato followed his gaze, heart thumping loudly in his ears. Tsukumo was curled up in the middle of the floor, his back to Minato and Kakashi, and looking for all the world as if he'd fallen asleep there in the same sleeping yukata he and Kushina had left him in. The thick stain of blood spreading through the tatami mat beneath him told differently. The smile slipped from Minato's face as he moved toward him, knowing exactly what he was looking at and still unable to comprehend. His senses had to be lying to him. He crouched next to Tsukumo, mindful not to kneel in the blood like Kakashi had done, and reached out to lay his fingers across his neck. But he didn't need to test for a pulse. Tsukumo was cold. It was as if he was touching nothing more than a slab of meat, and the blood that had spilled from his stomach had congealed. There was nothing that could be done or said. Even if the best medic in the world was standing here instead of Minato, it would have been too late. It was. Already over. The note of explanation lay in Tsukumo's hand, sealing the situation with his own signature. The most powerless person in the world would have understood how he felt then. Death was something he knew well, intimately so, and he'd seen comrades fall right before his eyes in the last war and had watched how a person could be transformed into nothing but a body. There was a certain acceptance of that out in a battlefield, but to see such a quietly violent scene in the safety and peacefulness of the home. For it to be Tsukumo? Minato's hand lifted away from his neck, and he paused, watching how his own fingers shook. What was he supposed to do now? What was he going to tell Kushina? What was he going to do with Kakashi? Was there a will? Why had he done this? Minato squeezed his hand tight into a fist and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the trembling had stopped for good. He knew what had to be done. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.